Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 4 cubits and a span. That's tall. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel,
"Why have you come out to draw me up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not just servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall all be our servants and serve us."
When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were greatly afraid. Now David was Saul's youngest son. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. One day, David rose early in the morning and went down the valley and heard Goliath's taunt and challenged David. David said to Saul,
"Let no one's heart fail because of it. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine."
Saul said to David,
"You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth."
But David persisted, and so Saul said to David,
Go, and may the Lord be with you."
Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul,
"I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them."
So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his pocket and drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David and his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David,
"Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks and stones?"
And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David,
"Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field."
But David said to the Philistine,
"You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down."
When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his pocket, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. Yet there was no sword in David's hand. Our gospel scripture this morning is taken from Matthew chapter 14, verses 21 to 23. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side. While he dismissed the crowds, and after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and beginning to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
I have a bit of confession to make, a bit awkward here in the pulpit wearing my clergy shirt and my stole and my cross. I never wanted to be a minister. It's such a strange thing to do. It's such an anomaly. A pastoral minister, when I went into this organized institutional religion, was the sort of thing like we see in the pews today in pulpits on Sunday. This was all rapidly disappearing. And I thought, really, is this something I want to get involved in? Churches are closing, congregations are smaller. This doesn't look like a really good career trajectory. And while it was a surprise to me that I found myself becoming a minister, it was a real shock for my family. Now, our family wasn't by any definition religious. Mom grew up in a fairly strict Anglican household in Newfoundland, and Dad in a Baptist one here in Ontario. And these were the no-nonsense, no-fun, God-fearing sorts of religion. Lots of church on Sunday in clean, well-pressed clothes. A really boring afternoon, no cards, no music, no nothing. Followed by a hearty dinner in the evening. So when Mom and Dad got married, it was a very simple service at the Presbyterian Church. I think they saw that as sort of a neutral ground, neutral zone. And as the family expanded with 4 kids, many dogs, and other assorted hangers-on, church wasn't even in our background. Now, in all of this, I think our family was a bit of an outlier. After all, this was the 1960s when almost everyone went to church on Sunday. Church attendance peaked in Canada in about 1964, and churches were all packed every Sunday. Weekday programs were full, congregations erected new churches and built new Sunday school wings to handle the crowds. You can check this out for yourself. This part of Ebenezer looks much newer than that, but so many churches put up Sunday school wings and new churches and all manner of buildings in the 1960s. And after peak church in the mid-60s, things began to fall off. Slowly at first, then more quickly. So that these days, the United Church closes about 1 preaching point a week. Yes, I heard someone do a scary. The Anglicans, the Presbys, the Lutherans, and the Baptists are much in the same boat. Roman Catholic churches are faring a little bit better, largely due to immigration from Catholic countries, where the postmodern sort of wave of secularism hasn't quite taken hold yet. Many evangelical churches are thriving, but are constantly in recruitment mode as people come, get all enthusiastic and participate for a while, and then typically get bored and move on. So when I started into ministry with a lot of hesitation, my family and my friends went, "What?" And they did what in a really big way. Where did all this religion come from, Dan? And aren't you really sort of signing up for a bit of a losing team here? Well, I'm not going to dwell on my faith call or why I decided in the end to become a minister. I'm going to save that for maybe some cozy night by the fire. But the point of my decision on taking on a losing game against overwhelming odds, well, that point was well taken. And that's sort of where we find David this morning. David is a shepherd boy, a youth, who loved to sing and make up songs. You'll remember that the Psalms are all attributed to David, and he wrote these as he tended his father's sheep in the hills around Jerusalem. His older brothers had gone to battle, and they, along with all the other Israelites, were losing really, really badly. And then the Philistines had brought out their secret weapon, their equivalent of the Scud missile, or their Sherman tank, or their drone bomber. They brought out Goliath. He's a giant. He's strong beyond imagination. He's clothed in the best armor and armed with the best weapons that money can buy. As they say, he's full of piss and vinegar as well as hubris. And then David goes into the battlefront, and he's drawn into the fray. His brothers equip him with all the usual armor and weapons of war, again, the best that they have. But David can hardly move. After all, he is just a boy. I was so pleased when Xavier came up to read for us, because we often think of David like the statue that Michelangelo carved. Tall, muscular, big guy. David was probably more Xavier's age. Handsome and ruddy too. But his brothers put all this equipment on him and this giant spear, and David can hardly move. After all, he's just a lad. So he sheds it all, picks up some stones and his slingshot, toys and a slingshot. These are weapons of a kid playing in the field. But he ends up slaying Goliath. And that's incredible. It's remarkable. Let's set aside the politics for a second of Goliath being the bad guy and David being the good guy. What's remarkable for me is that David understood who he was, and he ended up wanting to work with the tools that he knew. If he had kept the heavy armor, if he'd attempted to wield that magnificent sword that his brothers had given him, well, Goliath would have made mincemeat out of him just as he had with all the others. No, David succeeded because he knew himself, knew his strengths, saw the situation from a different angle than all his brothers and all the other fighters had, and knew that he had something unique to offer, even with all the odds stacked against him. I'm wondering if that is sort of where we, as church, as Ebenezer, find ourselves these days. Let's face it, it's a really, really difficult time to be church. It ain't like the 60s. The odds are against us. We live in an increasingly secular society, not just locally, but globally. Religion, particularly Christian organized religion, the thing that we do in churches like this all across the country, is, I'm sad to say, terribly unfashionable. People love to say that they're spiritual but not religious. They love to go for long walks on the beach. Maybe they feel the divine when they walk in the forest, and there's even books about the spirituality of golf. And maybe even they get little bits of inspirational poetry and hang it up at home. But by and large, they're not interested in something that might be deeper, more challenging, perhaps less individualistic, or, heaven forbid, takes Jesus seriously. So our congregations are smaller, they're older, they're struggling. Finances are tighter and volunteers are fewer. The young people are scarce. Often conflict and misunderstanding emerges from the anxiety and the uncertainty of these hard times. And just to add to that discouraging mix, our buildings are more expensive to maintain and heat. And some condo developers just standing out on Brimley Avenue, salivating over this property, thinking, this would be a great condo development. Maybe we could call it something like the Sanctuary, or the Divine Tower, or Spirit Place. Have I sort of captured what's going on in your hearts and your minds these days, Ebenezer? Some of your anxieties and woes, some of your perplexity and confusion, maybe named some of your Goliaths. Well, I'm right here with you. And that was the bad news. But there is good news. Because I think in all this process, we are discovering that we are more like David than Goliath. When the chips are down, when the odds are overwhelmingly against us, and all the old ways don't seem to work, we can look to David, resolute in our convictions, strong in our faith, understanding deep down who we are and what our strengths are, and accept the reality that the conventional, traditional, and the usual ways of going to battle, of doing business, of being church, just don't work anymore. And that's really hard as well. Because many of those old things, well, they used to work. Often they are things we love, and they'd made so much sense. Now, if I were one of David's brothers and saw him heading out to battle in a little tunic with no sword and no armor, and maybe just a couple of little stones that he picked out of the creek and put in his pocket and a slingshot, I think I'd be like, well, bro, it's been good to know you. Because what David is doing is utterly foolishness. It's utter foolishness, it's ridiculous, and it's completely illogical. And speaking of foolish, ridiculous, and illogical, what about Jesus walking on water and encouraging Peter to do the same? This is a favorite passage for theologians and preachers to pick apart. Does Jesus actually walk on the water? Does Peter? What does the water represent? What does the boat mean? There's a lot to figure out here and much to debate. But the essential point for me in this story, and I think what it means for us as church, to Ebenezer today, I think is simple. Jesus invites us to do something we are really, really, really afraid to do. Something we are 99 and 44, 100% sure it's not going to end well. Jesus calls, come, have faith, step out of the boat and onto the water. And what are we doing? No way, no way. We know what it's like to get wet and to sink. But that's where our faith comes in, isn't it? If we, Peter, or us, for that matter, knew for certain that we could walk on water, well, there's no faith question there. It's when we're almost certain that we are going to sink, well, that's when our faith is necessary and our faith comes into play. And that's where we find hope, in that slim, slim bit of possibility, and by doing something challenging, maybe even dangerous. Because staying in the boat is no longer an option. I'm chair of the board for Broadview magazine. Some of you will still think of it as The Observer. And as the chair of the board, I hope you're all subscribers. Commercial plug. At Broadview, we're facing a dilemma just like this. We can continue to publish the magazine just as it is. Broadview is the oldest continuously published periodical in North America, going back to the 1830s. It wins countless awards. And we could stay in the boat, publishing it exactly the way we do it, until basically we run out of money. Or we can try and do something different. Not different just because different is different, for different sake, but something that takes the journalism and what we stand for in a new direction. It's risky. It's enormously risky. It's like trying to walk on water. And we know our chances are slim, but we know we can't stay in the boat. Because here's the little secret. Here's the little secret that I think they forgot to put in the Bible. The boat is taking on water. It's sinking. And despite all appearances otherwise and our wishful thinking, the boat isn't a safe place to stay. And it's not the right place to stay. Now, I don't want to be the kind of visiting preacher who swans in and pretends everything is all sunshine and unicorns and it will all be all right. Here, just borrow my rose-tinted glasses and everything will be just peachy. Being church today is hard. There is no question. It's really hard. But anything worth doing is hard. And Jesus didn't promise us a rose garden. He didn't even promise us rose-colored glasses. He asks us to join him on a journey, to follow in his footsteps, to set out across the water, and maybe even walk with him to the cross. But along the way, he does promise one thing, one perfect thing, that he will be with us, to hold our hand, to lift us up as we venture out on the water with hope and against all the odds and against our almost certainty that we are going to sink. There's no guarantee of success. Only the absolute certainty that whatever we are doing, we are not alone. Goliath came at David with enormous strength, shielded by sturdy armor and armed with the best weapons that money could buy. Goliath embodied everything David feared in his worst nightmares. And everyone, including David, knew the odds were unsurmountable, totally against him. He didn't stand a chance. Yet against the odds, against all the naysayers, including his friends and even his brothers, David prevailed. He prevailed because he knew who he was, not a warrior, but a shepherd. He realized his strengths, not his weaknesses, and looked at the challenges in front of him, the giant challenge, and all his fears, and he looked at them head on. Foolish, ridiculous, and illogical. Absolutely. But absolutely the right thing for him to do. Jesus walks on the water, and Peter attempts to do the same, and starts to sink. Well, of course. Again, foolish and ridiculous and illogical. But also absolutely right. Not because he sank, but because he had the courage to step out of the boat. I ventured into ministry at a time when churches were closing and congregations were struggling, and Jesus' good news seems to be drowned out at every corner by all the worldly noise. Another foolish, ridiculous, and illogical decision. But also the right one for me, because when the Spirit calls, we have no option about whether we're going to answer or not. So friends, Ebenezer, what is God calling you to be and do in this time of transition and change? In this time of confusion and turmoil? What are the Goliaths that you have to face down? What are your deepest fears? And how will you face them? Putting on armor that doesn't fit, well, we know that won't work. Staying in the boat as it is isn't an option. Pretending the water isn't wet and deep won't save you. Choosing your tools wisely, knowing yourself well, playing to your strengths mindfully, and taking bold, faithful, and honest steps out onto the water might just be the right thing. It may seem foolish, and that's okay. It may seem ridiculous. better still. It may even seem illogical, but logic isn't always the best yardstick, especially when it comes to matters of the heart and faith and soul. Like David, you have strengths, faith, and skill that you may not even be aware of yet. Like Peter, you might have to step out of the seeming safety of the boat and get your feet wet. And like so many of us, you might have to discover and rediscover who you are and where God is leading you. It may well seem foolish and ridiculous and illogical. But so was helping and healing a leper. So was chatting with a Samaritan woman at a well. So was turning over the tables in the temple. And so was riding a donkey into Jerusalem. And if so, we might just find ourselves in really good company. And that, my friends, is not foolish at all. Amen.